I saw a statistic recently that something like 50% of people in America are considering a career change. And it didn't surprise me. And probably because when I look back at my own career, the constant theme has changed. I've changed career fields, things within careers. I started out at McKinsey, the big consulting firm that was at the height of its kind of boom in the late 90s. And after about a year and a half in consulting, this was 2000 to give you a frame, I got the itch to go into the startup world because the startups were all the rave. And I joined a startup that promptly imploded about 6 months later in the dot-com bust, as did the next two that I joined. And then at the ripe age of 25, I became a venture capitalist. I became a managing director at a venture capital firm in New York. I didn't quite know what that was, just to be honest with you. But it was an incredible experience. I learned a ton. But then after 5 years, went back to my love of starting companies, started several companies, and then ended up spending a decade in tech as an executive at several other companies, at Microsoft, at PayPal, until eventually I went back to my love of creating something from scratch and founded the company that I run now, Happier, which originally was a tech company, is now a learning and development company. So even within that, I've changed a lot. And when I look back at all the career changes, it wasn't easy. Changing things is not easy. I definitely wouldn't say my path has been easy, but it's been very full. Like I feel like my career, my life's been very full. And that's something about change that I love to talk about and inspire people. And why we're doing this podcast is with the right mindset and the right strategy. And if it's rooted in the right place, I think change can be really meaningful and invigorating. And my guest today is one of the people who I draw inspiration from her own journey and her expertise on career change. And so I'm really excited to talk to her today. Dorie Clark is a top keynote speaker and consultant. She teaches executive education at Columbia University. She is a Wall Street Journal bestselling author of many books, including Reinventing You. That's my favorite. The Long Game, Entrepreneurial You, and Stand Out, which was actually named the #1 leadership book of the year by Inc. magazine. A former presidential campaign spokeswoman. I have to look at my notes so I get this right because I love this. Dorie has been described by the New York Times as an expert at self-reinvention and helping others make changes in their lives. So couldn't have a more perfect guest on this podcast. With that, Dorie, welcome to Reinventability. I'm so grateful you're here.
Natalie, thanks. Always fun to talk with you.
Yeah, ditto. I want to dive in, actually. I want to talk about your reinventions and your changes. And I want to dive in, and I was thinking about what I wanted to ask you on this. Perhaps let's start with you've made a lot of pivots in your career, pretty significant ones. What has been one that you'd say was perhaps the most challenging or rewarding? You can pick.
So I think that probably the most rewarding was making kind of the ultimate pivot, which was moving into self-employment. That was something that I had never really considered before, and I, it wasn't part of any kind of grand plan, but I was working at a nonprofit. I was a nonprofit executive director. And it was interesting because in that case, the opportunity kind of unfolded for me because I hadn't really understood that when you are the boss at a small organization, you really have to do a little bit of everything. I had previously had jobs where I was doing a specialized task. I was doing this thing, and it was great to go deep and to learn how to do this thing, whether it was writing articles for a newspaper or being a spokesperson on a campaign, as you said. And that was great. But if I had been thrown in and they said, okay, well, now, run the whole thing, figure out how to do everything else, I would have had no idea how to do it. But at this tiny, tiny nonprofit, we had, first 2 employees, then 3 employees. And so I really did kind of have to understand how to do a little bit of everything. And it surprisingly kind of gave me a sense of confidence that I could run my own business if I wanted or needed to. And I thought, oh, there's a lot of freedom and flexibility in working for myself. And now I have a little bit of evidence that that's a thing that I can handle. So that was the shift that I made back in 2006.
And did you have fear? Because I always like to ask people, I've started many different businesses, and people always tell me, "Oh, you seem so confident." I tell them, "Well, I have a lot of fear. I just have something that's more important than fear." Did you have fear or doubt when you decided to do this? 'Cause it's a big shift.
It definitely is. I am really a big risk mitigation person. And so I will say I did not actually have any fear. And the reason was that I was making so little money running the nonprofit that I really felt like even if what I needed to do was like sell plasma, I could probably make as much money as I was getting running this nonprofit. Like I could figure that out. It was, I totally get it. Like if I had been making hundreds of thousands of dollars at, some elite firm and then I was, trying to shift over. I mean, yeah, like the golden handcuffs are real, but I did not have golden handcuffs in any way. So it was all upside pretty much. So
I
I support starting from a very low base of expectations.
Yeah, no, well, I love that. I love that you position it as risk mitigation. Makes sense. Something I think a lot about, I talk a lot about. One of the reasons change is hard is because our brain has loss aversion, right? We're averse to loss. That's how human brains are built. We don't want to lose the familiar, the safe. Even if there's something over there that's more shiny, we really don't want to lose it. So, in a way, you didn't have that much to lose, and that can be really helpful. So let me ask you this question, because you've done tremendously well in your business. Because you share stuff that's so meaningful and helpful, and it helps a lot of people. What would you say? I'm thinking of my younger self, but a lot of people who are thinking of maybe going from being in a traditional career to starting something on their own, who have that fear, maybe who have a lot to lose, who feel that maybe, "Ooh, I don't know if I can make it work." Um, how would you guide them?
So one of my books that you were mentioning a moment ago was Reinventing You.
Yes.
The one I want to kind of zoom in on for a minute is my third book, Entrepreneurial You, where I talk a lot about how to make the shift to self-employment for people who want to do it. And for me, I think the most important point is that I think the cultural narrative that we have, the kind of discussion in the public sphere, the way that we think about it as a society, is a little bit off because so many of the metaphors, the way people talk about it is, oh, we're taking the leap, we're plunging in, and it just sounds like this, horrible risky thing, and a lot of smart sensible people hear that and they're like, well, I don't want to do that, that doesn't sound like a good idea at all, and so they assume that it means that entrepreneurship is not for them. But actually, I think entrepreneurship could potentially be for them. It's just that we're saying it wrong. I don't think it's actually a good idea for almost anyone to just quit their job and then say, okay, well, tomorrow I'm going to figure out what I will do. That's in some ways that's what I did. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have any idea. um, I had a few smart things that I did for about a year prior to starting my business. I started taking classes at this like local adult education center, and I knew there were a lot of things I didn't know. So I would sign up for these like weekend long classes on creating a budget and how to manage your QuickBooks and things like that, and it was helpful. But what I really should have been doing, more important than any of that, is actually trying to get clients and trying to see if people would pay me for the work. That was a thing I did not do, and it was a mistake. I mean, I figured it out, but I think that if more people, asterisk, we're assuming that there's not a, competitive contract issue with their current employer, but assuming that's the case, if more people can keep their day job and then experiment on the side, get validation that people actually want to pay them for the thing and that they like doing the thing, you can actually build a very successful business prior to leaving your job. So it essentially de risks the entire enterprise.
I really love that way of thinking about it, and again, as you're talking, I'm reflecting on a lot of people, a lot of leaders that I mentor, my own experience. I love, I haven't thought about it that way, Dory, that we talk about, this entrepreneurship as like making a giant leap, you know, whereas it's, it's actually rarely that way. Like when I think about how I started Happier, for about a year before I even had the thought to start a company, I was working at PayPal. We'd sold a company that I helped run to them. I was really miserable, like commuting from Boston to, San Jose with a little child. It was painful. But I started to read research on gratitude. And I started to use it. It helped me. And then I was like, wait, I want to teach other people how to do this. And then I started to just think about, and I started to experiment. Happier started as an email that I would send to a bunch of people to ask them to share 3 things they were grateful for, because that's what the research said. If you can share a few things a day, and then they would tell me, like, after a while, wow, this is really helping. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. And then eventually that led to the idea of let's build a mobile app. And that led to and so I love that you're right. The narrative is that it's a leap, but actually most of the time it can be a more gradual process where you learn, do and learn, do and learn, do and learn. What about, because I love, I was looking at my notes, I wrote this down from so many, you talk a lot about this idea of testing, right? Like test your hypothesis. And like when you want to change, like if you feel stuck in your career. So what about for people who they don't want to start their own business, but they're feeling stuck. They're in a place where they're either feeling stuck or I don't know, they're feeling the need for something new, but they're not quite sure what it is. I love how you talk about like creating a hypothesis and testing it. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's sad when somebody feels stuck, right? It's a thing we want to help, we want to fix, but it's also true that some people feel stuck and they know what the thing is they would like to be doing, but plenty of people don't. They know the first part, like I'm not loving the thing right now, but it's just a mystery what would be different or better. And for obvious reasons, I mean, this is the smart move. They don't want to just like change for the sake of changing and then find themselves 6 months later in the exact same spot because they're like, well, I guess that wasn't it. So the question is, if you are feeling stuck, what are some things that you can do? What are some low risk things that you can do that can shake things up a little bit and maybe give you a little bit more clarity? And for me, it makes me think about a woman that I actually profiled in Reinventing You named Karen. She was an attorney and she was just not happy. She was really bored. She was doing the same thing all the time. And what she decided to do, which I thought was so cool actually, is she realized, okay, I mean, yes, there's nights and weekends, although when you're a lawyer and you're working hard, there's not a lot of those either. But
Right.
you realize that the one pocket of time she really had was she had her lunch break. And so she decided that she would embark upon a campaign essentially through people that she knew, through friends of friends, that at least once a week, and sometimes even a couple times a week, she would try to make a lunch date with someone. And she would pick people that she thought specifically seemed really interesting. They had interesting jobs, they were doing interesting things, and she was just curious about them and wanted to learn more about it. And she said that even in these like really dark times when her job itself was not fun, that was like the one thing that she could look forward to. Like, oh, well, tomorrow I get to see this person and I get to learn about them. And so she did this for weeks and weeks. But through the process of this very low key experimentation, she actually began to get a sense of other career paths that seemed legitimately interesting to her. And of course, these are preliminary leads. You have to research it more and ask more questions. But ultimately, what she discovered, and I mean, this was not on her radar to begin with at all, but ultimately she decided she wanted to become a career counselor at a university. And so, a pretty useful path, as we're thinking about the Venn diagram, is that she got a job at a law school as a career advisor. This makes a lot of sense. Obviously, she had been a practicing lawyer, so she had a lot of credibility. She was a good candidate for that. But it helped her make the switch into academia and helping other people and being in this environment of academic curiosity, which was a lot more satisfying to her. But it all started with the thing that she could do, which is inviting people out for lunch dates.
I love that. And I remember now that you're talking about it, I remember reading about that. And I love that it's like a curiosity conversations, right? I do find, in my work with people that often people feel stuck because they don't have a vision for what they want. I find that generally we don't spend a lot of time thinking about what we want, right? We're busy, we have a lot going on. Even leaders I work with, they always think about like, here's a problem I have to solve, here's what I have to do. And, one of my inspirations for creating this podcast on reinventability is to encourage people to spend time envisioning possibilities. Like, what is it that you want? And then I love this example because then it's not just sitting around and thinking. right? You have to do something to learn more, to explore, to actually take an action. So I love that example. One of the concepts that I love in your work on this is a pre-mortem that you talk about. So, I grew up in the startup world, so we did a lot of post-mortem, right? We'd do a 2-week sprint, we'd release something, or a month, 2 sprints, and then we sit around and we do a post-mortem. What worked, what didn't work, what did customer love, where did we screw up, what did we do well? What's a pre-mortem, and how is it useful for someone who is, maybe considering a career change, but is not entirely sure what or how?
Yeah. So a premortem is basically just what the name implies. It is, it's sort of the postmortem is analyzing after death of whatever project. Well, what went wrong? What did or right, but often wrong. And how do you analyze it? A premortem is just doing the reverse, which is taking a course of action that you're considering and wargaming out what could go wrong. Sort of putting yourself in the position of saying, all right, let's pretend that it is a month after, a year after, whatever it is, and it's gone really badly. I mean, most people don't even like to put themselves in this headspace, but let's assume it's gone really badly. What went wrong? And if you can identify the things that are most likely, then you can work backwards to try to answer the question, well, is there something we could do to prevent that? Or is there something we could do to mitigate that? Now, inevitably there's always going to be things that we can that we just can't predict. I mean, there's a guy that I know, a lovely guy, who such a brilliant idea. He bought a coffee shop in January of 2020. It was a coffee shop
Oh,
that
no.
was located inside a New York City train station.
Oh.
I mean, so many commuters, right? Won't it be amazing? And
It was for a month.
yeah, yeah. Like, poor guy. Like, you really cannot blame this man for whatever difficulties he had. None of us could have called that. So that's life sometimes. But it's also true that there are a lot of things that are predictable, that are foreseeable. And maybe it's okay, I'm gonna quit my job, I just hate it so much, I'm gonna quit it right now, and I'm gonna go look for a job. And maybe you make an assumption that you're going to find a new job in 3 months. Well, what would it look like if it actually took you 6 months? What would it actually look like if you took 12 months? Is there a plan B? Is there could you be an Uber driver? Like, what's the thing you're going to do if the worst case scenario happens, so that you can prevent that from happening? But there's also branding variations. I mean, it's like, okay, if you want to make a switch of some kind, it's useful to think about, oh, well, if I've spent my whole career at a big company and I decide that I want to come into a little tiny boutique thing, well, what's the baggage that I'm going to have to deal with? And you can imagine, right? I mean, it's not so hard to predict. It's, oh, he thinks he's so smart because he was at IBM. All he talks about is, well, we did it like this at IBM. And, like, okay, so how do you make sure you're not that guy? And, all the little things that we can do that just make life a little easier if we think of them up front.
I love that, for another reason. I mentor a lot of people through change, mostly leaders who are either stepping into greater leadership or people starting companies. And like we talked about at the beginning, there is always fear of change because it means doing something unfamiliar, right? Even if you're excited about it, the brain doesn't like to do new things. So that creates doubt. And one of the exercises that I have them do is I have them envision the worst case scenario. And people always get really surprised because it's, ew, who wants to think about that? But it's actually really powerful, both from a place of, okay, well, how could I mitigate some of it? But also, once we envision what some bad things or difficult things or worse things that could happen, it actually calms down our brain. So instead of having to worry about them, the brain is like, oh, so this could happen and there's a plan. Okay. It's
Yeah,
not that
no,
I'm excited for it to happen. So, it's interesting. Sometimes the things that we really don't want to think about are really, really helpful to think about.
that's totally true. I mean, we tend to universally catastrophize, and so you get a situation where, because you're not specifically naming the fear and it just feels like very amorphous, it seems like, okay, well, if this doesn't work, then everything in your life is going to be horrible irrevocably. And I mean, realistically, it's like, okay, let's say you take a new job with a new company and you don't like it, or your boss is mean or whatever, and so you quit after 3 months. I mean, that's unfortunate, but if you don't name it in your head, what's happening is you're going to lose all of your money. You're going to have your house foreclosed on. Your spouse will leave you, and you will be exposed to public shame in your community, and no one will ever want to talk to you again. And realistically, it's more like, oh, you'll probably have to get a different job somewhere else. Like it's
That's
it's
right.
just orders of magnitude less bad than the subconscious picture that we paint.
No, it's such a great way to think about it. It made me think there's this psychologist and spiritual thought leader. He's passed away, David Hawkins. I remember I watched one of his videos and he talked about. He said, "Look, every fear you have is ultimately a fear of death." And I was like, "What?" He was like, "Yeah, just take a fear and just keep asking, and then what?" And you just made me think of it. Like, okay, I take a new job at a company and I hate it. Okay, and then what? I have to leave, and then what? Well, I don't make any money. And then what? My family leaves me. My family doesn't have food. Okay. And then what? I'm homeless. I can't pay for anything. And then what? I die. Okay. So your fear is actually of dying. So now you know that's what it is. Okay. Let's go back to the first step. How could you make sure that when, you hate your job, it doesn't end in death? And so you just made me think of that. You're right. When we don't get clear about it's like this blob, and that I think is one of the reasons that I find that people get stuck is they start to think of making the change, and then it's this big blob of scary, and they're like, no, it's just better to stay here. Um, Talk a little bit about the other piece that I always really love in your work is really getting connected to like what is motivating a change, because I think a really good friend of mine recently left a job. She was there for 7 years. She was an executive on the marketing side, biotech company, just in a very difficult situation, and just was stuck and finally decided to leave. And she said to me, I just need to like leave. Like I'm not picking the best thing. I just right now need to leave. And she actually left and is doing great in the new company. And we were sitting around, and there was another friend, and he said to her, well, you can never leave just to run away from something. The only time to leave is you have to really have like the next thing lined up. And I said, I differ. I differ. I think sometimes you just need a change. And so I'd love your thoughts, because you talk a lot about like figuring out what's motivating the change.
Yeah, I think it is a really interesting philosophical question. I mean, I suppose if it was a pattern where someone is always leaving,
Yes.
and then that becomes a pathology or something. But I can certainly imagine a scenario where just stuff has gone south and you're like, no, no, I'm out of here. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You have to be smart about your scenario, and that often means not living in absolutes, but instead looking at the particular situation. I mean, of course, when it comes to work, which is the mechanism that most people use to pay for things, I think a crucial question always has to be like, well, what's the runway? And of course, I would never suggest that somebody precipitously quit their job if they didn't have sufficient savings, or you know a spouse that could help, or some other mechanism, because that can be really hard. I know that during the times in my life prior to starting my own business, it always took me a long time to find jobs. I mean, it wasn't, I mean, I thought I was reasonably qualified, but like like add a multiple of three to whatever you think it's going to take you,
Yeah.
because it does. So I think that that's a key thing, but it also is really encouraging, on the flip side. And I think this is the part that people don't realize, that if you have a long enough runway, like if you, whether through savings that you've previously accumulated, or just, a willingness to kind of deal with the situation, you actually can have really big dreams. Like that's the thing. There's sort of an inverse relationship between I have to make a change this minute, and if that's the case, well, you kind of have to just grab the thing that's proximate. But if you are willing to wait in some capacity to sort of bide your time, you often can set your sights on something fairly large that might feel impossible in the present moment, but you can strategize your way to it, which is very cool. So in Reinventing You, I tell a story about a woman named Patricia who got her start as a hairdresser in San Francisco. And, she had her own salon, and, it's great, cool. She was doing well for herself. But her real passion and what she really wanted to do was to become a professional speaker. And that seems a really long way away from being a hairdresser. But she started first by speaking at hairdressing conventions. And, okay, great. She has credibility there. So people want to hear her. But then she made friends with the business people who were her customers, because she worked, in downtown San Francisco. She had a lot of executives. And she started sort of mentioning to them that, she'd have conversations, and they thought she had really smart insights about things where there was a lot of overlap between hairdressing and business, like customer service and things like that. And so she actually got a few breaks from those people. And she had a 10-year lease on her salon. And her vision for herself is, you know what? In 10 years, I am going to have built up my speaking career to the point where I can just walk away from this, and I'm not going to renew the lease. I'm just going to, close the door and walk into my new career. And that is exactly what she was able to do, because she gave herself a long runway and she built a lot of connections. And to this day, she's a very successful professional speaker.
I love that. And, Dory, I wonder if you find this in your work, but often um, we don't dream big enough. We don't envision big enough. And, I've even said, and I tend to think big. I'm an entrepreneur by nature. I'm always kind of thinking ahead in a bigger way. But I have found, I'm 48, almost 49. I have found that when I was younger, I was bolder. And I think some of it is natural, right? As we grow, there's more to lose, right? A mortgage and a family and sort of kind of credibility. But I think it's really, really like a core. Again, it's one of the reasons I'm creating this podcast and all this body of work around reinventability, which is a word that I made up to describe this ability that we all have to envision what is possible, right? And to evolve and grow into like our true potential. Do you find that in your work that somehow do you find that some people just naturally dream bigger than others? Can we learn? I guess that's my question. Can we learn to think and dream bigger?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can learn to do just about anything, right? As long as it's not violating the laws of physics, I feel like,
That's right.
yes, we can do it. So definitely, I think the potential is there. I think that, this is a situation that sometimes feels intractable for people, because it just touches on very core things, very very basic elements, that frankly were created a long time ago. A lot of it, frankly, is our childhoods. And there's a reason people don't dream big, which is that they don't want to be disappointed if it doesn't happen. And I think that it's I mean, there's also, there's in our culture, there's contradictory elements all over the place. But there's the famous quote, often attributed to Thoreau. Whether he said that, I have no idea. But it's, like, when you reach for, for the heavens or whatever, don't be sad, if because you'll just end up with a star, something like that. And it's like, well, yeah, like, I have pretty big dreams. This is something I'm not especially afraid of. Like, one of the ones that I have and that I've sort of put out there. Not tomorrow. Tomorrow would be impractical. But, like, I'm thinking in 10 years and 20 years, I would like to be appointed a U.S. ambassador to somewhere cool. I think that would be awesome. I think I'd do a good job. Like, I'm all about making friends with foreigners and eating their cookies and stuff. I think I could do a great job
Where do you want to
representing
go,
America.
Dory? I love this so much. Where would you want to go?
I'm really pretty flexible. I would just say, not a war zone, but that's great. They wouldn't want to put me in a war zone anyway. So, that's those poor career service people. They handle all the Afghanistans of the
That's
world.
right.
Like, stick me in Denmark, stick me, someplace. I understand that, like, France is for the people who give like a ton of money, so I probably wouldn't get that. But give me a nice little cool country where I can make friends, for America. That would be amazing. And that sounds like a sort of big impossible goal. Like, I don't really know how I would do that exactly. Am I going to be crying on my deathbed if that never works out. I mean, no, that's okay. Like my identity and my self-worth is not based on the premise of like, wow, I'll be a zero if this never happens. But I do think it would be cool. And I think that honestly, the only way to actually make it happen is to sort of start thinking about it or ideating or putting it out there in some way. So I think that what we need to help people do is to decouple their sense of identity from individual goals, and to understand that like whether or not you do a particular thing, whether or not you accomplish a particular check mark, doesn't mean you're a good or a bad person, or doesn't mean you're a failure or a success, and it's this binary thing. It's like, you know what, there's a lot of ways to be successful, and there's a lot of things that we can think about and try. And I think the more we're able to sort of publicly drill home that message, the more it can be helpful to people to sort of expand their thinking about what's possible.
I think that is such an essential point, Dorie. And first of all, I love that we're having this conversation. This is something I've never heard you say. So I love knowing that that's one of your bold, wild dreams. I was actually just listening to a podcast, I forget which one, on which Rahm Emanuel, who is an ambassador in Japan to Japan, and is something. I mean, obviously, he has a long political career, but he was talking about how it's just nothing he would ever expected to be doing. So it's funny. I just listened to it like last week, and here you are. Um, but I just think it's such an essential point to separate who we are from what we do. And I think that's, I mean, I'll be honest, as an entrepreneur, most of my career, I found that to be challenging, right? Um, or even, writing books, or, essentially running a company that is me, my brand, like you, where, okay, so my book doesn't do as well. Wow, that means I suck as a person, as an author, right? It's hard. And I think, I work with a lot of leaders who are not entrepreneurs, and wow, my team's not doing well. Like, I must be a bad leader. So I think that's really challenging, but I think that's such an important point, as you say, to drill that. One thing that I have found is, in my own experience and working with people, when you have a bold goal or just something you want, even making some progress towards it, even if you don't achieve it, is really life affirming. And you may learn something along that amount of progress you've made that enriches your life or makes you go in a different direction. And so there, focus on progress, not perfection, is another cliche, but there's actually something in it, because just going for something or just wanting something that's like bold and exciting and taking some action towards it, I think is really meaningful. I'd love your thoughts on like how to help someone who is like sitting here nodding right now, but is still like, well, it's nice, Dorie and Natalie, to separate my identity, but I don't know how to do that, because I feel like, if I was talking to a woman last week who was offered a very senior leadership position in her company, and she is seriously considering not doing the interview rounds, because she on very honestly said to me, which I really appreciate. She said, "Look, have a great team, and I have a lot of respect in this company. If I go through the rounds and I don't get it, I would have failed. Everyone's going to think less of me. I'm not sure I want to do it." So I'd love your thoughts on, to actually, how do we do that? Because it's so important, but tough.
Yeah, can you send her to me so I can give her a shake for you? I mean, it's like so sad when people say
Let's give
things
her a
like it's
shake
so
right now,
horrifying.
because I know she's not alone.
Oh, yeah, no, it's terrible. It's terrible. I mean, I really, I try to eat my own dog food here, because I gave myself a good hearty dose of this a couple years ago, because I decided, and this is something we have talked about. I decided that I wanted to start writing musical theater, and I had never done it before. This was not like returning to an old passion. I had never done it before, so I was starting from zero, and it is certainly very humbling, because I think a problem, frankly, that most middle-aged people or whatever have, is that if you've been doing things reasonably right, you have achieved a certain level of success, and you feel good about that. You're like, oh yes, yes, I'm winning now. I've gotten to my place, whatever that place is, and you can see the distance between where that is now and where it was, and you're feeling like you're rocking it. And then if you are somehow put back in, or you put yourself back in a situation where you are a beginner, it can feel really humiliating or destabilizing. And so I was in this situation where, I mean, on one hand, you look at it and like, it's not like my accomplishments went away. I mean, professionally, I still had done a lot of things. I'd published books and whatever, but I was in this class, in this program, where almost everybody else had, in that particular realm, better credentials than me. There was a guy who was in this program with me. We're starting out as like, freshmen or whatever. He was literally a music professor. So, okay, he teaches at a freaking university teaching music theory. There were multiple people who were graduates of NYU's Tisch School, which is, one of the premier musical theater
Yeah.
training programs in the country. There were other people who were, they were fresh out of undergrad, but they had gone to Northwestern, to Elon, to different places that are considered like very top musical theater schools. They had, they had gone there and then they had run the musical theater review that year. I mean, they all knew more than me. And so it was very embarrassing because, there were like things that I probably should have known or that they knew, and it was obvious that I didn't know. And so I would just go home every Monday night, and I would just have a little mantra, and I just have to remind myself, like, my self-worth is independent of this scenario. And the truth is, it is a little hard because, I mean, some of the people were very nice, we became friends, but a share of those people really thought I was a moron. Like, they didn't know anything about my other accomplishments. I mean, they had no idea that I was like, successful in other realms. And so I think they just thought I was like this idiot, and they kind of looked down on me. And you just have to remind yourself, like, okay, these people don't know me. I'm very good in other things, and I am not going to let their judgment on this particular metric affect me. But you have to be very conscious about that, because of course it's easy if stuff gets mirrored to you, it's easy to take that on, but I just really consciously refuse to take that on.
I love that. And I just have to say, Dorie, and I've said this to you offline, but I want to say this officially on the podcast. Officially. One of the things I really admire you, and I've had a gift to get to know you personally a bit, but also in your work, is that you have achieved a lot of success, and yet you're still making bold moves and following things that you want. To me, that is the essence of reinventability. Is we all have many dimensions, right? Many dimensions. We all have many gifts. And to me, kind of the whole gig of it, the whole purpose of life is to like keep uncovering them in ways that excite us and then sharing them with others, because that's what we're here to do, right? To contribute. So I love that dimension of you, and you brought it out into the world. One of the things that made me think of is I feel like just the practice of like trying bold new things would be a really wonderful like practice for us to adopt as human beings on a regular basis, right? Just like we learn a skill by doing it. Well, this isn't, having mantra and things like that's helpful, but just doing it. And it made me think of when I was after college, I was at McKinsey, consulting, working 20 hours a day, which at the time was fine. Now I'm like, I don't understand how we survived, but that was what you did. And New York City was very exciting. But I'd always wanted to write. I don't know where it came from. I always wanted to write. And so on the side, and I don't know, the 4 hours that I wasn't working, because that's the cool thing when you're 22, you don't need to sleep very much. I started writing stories. I started to write a story about our journey as refugees. I started writing stories. And I remember, I don't think I've ever publicly shared this. This is fun. I think I wrote like 40 pages of our refugee story. And I had no idea, zero idea about publishing, like less than zero. But I looked up the address for Knopf and I sent them the 40 pages. Now, you and I have published a bunch of books. So, for everyone listening, like there's a process. You write a proposal, you choose an agent, the agent pitches. There's a whole, I knew nothing of this. And I just sent it to them. And the amazing thing is about 6 months later, I get a letter back. And the letter said, Natalie, this is a really incredible story. And you're actually a pretty good writer, but, you need to like actually know what you're doing and turn this into a book and blah, blah. But I just, Dorie, like the gift of this guy, I haven't thought about this in like 20 years. That felt really good to do. It took me another 20 years to write my book, Happier Now, in which I tell some of that story. But I remember at one time, like a few months later, I wrote a short story and I sent it to the New Yorker. So that was my aim, right? Like I just, I never, and I just, as talking to you and what you did with taking a class and starting theater, I just feel like this is a practice we should encourage ourselves and each other to just do more of, right? Just do bold things.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be clear, like bold doesn't have to mean risky. Like
Yes.
I think that's the issue is that people conflate them sometimes and they're like, well, I can't afford that risk. But it's not bold like quitting your job. It's not bold like putting yourself in financial jeopardy or physical jeopardy or whatever. Bold can just mean okay, maybe a little bit of ego jeopardy, but that's good. That keeps us honest. I mean, it can be just large or small. Like taking classes is wonderful. I have a coaching client that she's a big like personal growth person. She's always looking for different things, and like she's a business writer, and she signed up for a poetry class, and she's like, you know what, this is something I always liked. Poetry's cool, like maybe it can teach me something. And this was out of the box for her, but it was very interesting, and she just allowed herself to be a rookie and feel okay about it.
And that's actually brings me, the last question. I'm going to try to be disciplined. I want to ask you, one of the things that I have found is many times when I felt on my path that, oh, I need to change careers, actually, it wasn't about the job or the career. It's that there was another dimension of me that was calling to me, right? So, like, I paint, right? So, you're looking at paintings, but I didn't let myself paint until I was 40. Because I always was like, no, 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 what does this have to do with being successful, taking care of my family? I'm not going to do it. You know what? I think I probably would have made fewer career changes if I just let myself paint. And so I'd love for you to just talk about, because you have a lot of experience, coaching and working with people. When someone is thinking like, oh, I hate my job or I hate my life, like I need a change. How do you think about like actually figuring out, is it you want to change your career, or is it you need a hobby, or you want to start doing something that has nothing to do with your career and actually that's the change you're seeking? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you raise a really great point, Natalie. It reminds me actually of a good friend of mine. A while back, we had this phone conversation, and she was really stressed out, and she was just venting, and she's like, I mean, I'm so burned out. I'm working all the time. I'm so stressed out. She's like, I think I need a sabbatical. Like, I think I need to like take 6 months off work. Maybe I need to take a year off. Like, I need to fire all my clients and take a year off. And so I'm listening, I'm taking all this in, and just like knowing what I know about her, I was like, okay, maybe, yeah. I mean, that's put it on the whiteboard. That's an interesting idea. But I said, wait, just like backing up. Um, when was your last vacation? And she's like, oh, well, I mean, I don't know, like 2 years ago. And I'm like, okay, are when was the last day that you didn't work? And she's like, oh, well, I've been working every weekend, like for like the last 8 months. And I'm like, okay, so maybe you totally need a sabbatical. But what I'm going to suggest is that maybe first you take a weekend, and you might feel better after the weekend, and then see how that is. And then maybe you need like a week off. And how about we see where you are there? I think people are very binary. They often feel like what they need to do is like blow up their life because their life isn't working.
Yes.
But there's often like very much like minimal effective doses that if they just like took a day off, they would probably feel a lot better about the state of their affairs.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's something, again, core to how I'm thinking about like reinvention, reinventability. It's not, you don't have to burn it down. Again, it might just be something that is calling to you, and maybe you want to start writing. Great, write a blog, start writing stories, right? Maybe it's something else. Because I think, and it just circles back to how we started talking about when we think of it, when we make it very general, like, oh my God, I hate my job, I need to change careers. Well, then it's like, that's it, that's this big blog, right? I hate my job or I hate my life. What does it mean? Like, what do you enjoy? What do you not enjoy? So I think it's, in our conversation, I keep like coming back to like it's just having the discipline to, instead of like going ahead with these big general things that we tend to think about, is like having like the internal discipline to break it down, right? Just like in the pre-mortem, just like in mitigating risk, just break it down a little bit, right? Because I think that, because then it also, I find, like that can also be kind of a dead end, right? Like, oh my God, I hate my life, I hate my work, but I can't change anything right now, so I'm just going to be unhappy. Well, that's not the answer, right? All right, parting words, Dorie. I like to ask my guests, like anything, and actually from your personal experience, what's been something that you've done in your personal life, career, that had a surprisingly wonderful outcome?
Oh, I love that question. It's always nice to have surprisingly wonderful outcomes,
Yeah,
isn't
yeah.
it? You know, when it comes, so I'll give one example of something that I didn't necessarily expect. Back in 2016, I got really interested in the idea of doing online courses and things like that. And so for me, I was just thinking like, okay, I'll make a course and that's it. But something that actually was surprisingly wonderful is it's like when people, I always like it like when your audience, however audience is defined, this could be your coworkers, this could be whoever, but when your audience asks for something, because like people are very busy, and so when they actually bother to ask for something, that's like really good at, insight that like, oh, people actually want this. So people said, oh, but we want to interact with each other, like we don't want it to just be like a course where we learn things, we want to meet each other. And so for me, that turned into I had something called the Recognized Expert course, and it became the course in community. So we now have this online community. It's now 8 years later. There's like 800 people in the community, and we have meetups and we have events, and like I've met so many really great people who become my friends, and even nicer for me, like they've become friends with each other and collaborated and things like that. And it's not a thing that I planned. It was a thing that was like requested by people that I was able to help facilitate. And so that felt really nice.
I love that. And the other thing I see in your face, for those of you who are listening, you can also watch this on YouTube, but I get to see, Dory, you lit up when you were talking about how people started connecting with each other and like how great that felt. So I think the other wonderful thing for you was this unexpected way that you helped connect people that you didn't think about. I think that's such an awesome reminder. Dorie, as always, thank you for being you. Thank you for your warmth and insights and taking the time. I again, I'm very grateful not just for your time, but you continue to be an inspiration for me and for a lot of people that connect with you. And one of the things I just want to share with you that I really love is you're inspiring and practical. It's more like my favorite combination in life. And so I just want to say one last thing. You posted a video the other day, I think it was a video, maybe LinkedIn, I'm not sure where I saw it, about when we feel envious of someone, it could be a good thing. And what Dory said is like you might be inspired. Actually, let me give you the last word. What do you mean by that? Because that to me was kind of exemplified like something I really love about you and your work, and that it wasn't expected and it was inspiring, but I actually took very practical tidbits. So maybe I'll give you the last word to explain what you meant because I think it's actually it really stayed with me.
Oh, thank you, Natalie. I appreciate it. Yeah, really, what I was talking about was so often whenever we feel like a twinge of envy about someone professionally, the impulse is like, "Oh, shut it down! Don't talk about that. That's bad. No, don't do that." But what I've found, with coaching clients and people I know, is that oftentimes it can be a really useful clue because you ask someone like, "Well, where do you want your career to go, or what do you want things to look like in 5 years?" And most of the time people are like, I don't know. They're like they're like frozen, they have no idea. But actually, a really great trail of breadcrumbs for you to follow is to look at the people you have some little twinge of envy about, because obviously that's for some reason. I mean it could be because like, oh, he's so handsome, I want to be handsome like that. But professionally it's usually like, oh wow, I wish I could write a book, or oh wow, wouldn't it be amazing if I could be a VP and get to live in Asia too, or like whatever the thing is, there's like a piece of it that's really intriguing to you. And that's the hint that you can use to help sort of triangulate from here to there and be like, oh, I guess that's really resonating. I guess actually there's something about what they have done that speaks to me, and now I can use that as fuel to figure out what I can do to follow in those footsteps.
I love that. And therein is exactly what I love about you, Dory, in your work. inspiring, and then immediately practical. Thank you, Dorie. Thank you, listeners, always for tuning in. If you found this conversation valuable, if you learned something, if it inspired something new, please rate and review this podcast on your favorite platform. It's new. This will help other awesome humans find and discover and be inspired by it. And I will see you all and be in your ear on our next episode.